Hey, welcome to Startup Dad Headquarters. This is Joel Lewis coming to you with another amazing interview. I already know it's going to be amazing. Good friend of mine, Brian Shea, and let me go right into Brian's bio, and then we'll bring Brian in, and then he could kind of elaborate a little bit more. So Brian Shea is a management consultant and the founder of Shea Consulting LLC, a Boston-based consulting company that helps technology organizations collaborate with their business partners. Since the early 2000s, Brian has helped companies collaborate, define software requirements, and deliver successful projects that address real business needs. He has worked with a range of organizations from multinational firms like State Street Global Advisors and Iron Mountain and large nonprofit profits to companies that are just starting out. Today, he focuses on helping technology organizations to build effective requirement practices, strong communication, and analysis skills among employees, and effective strategic projects. So that's a little bit about Brian. We'll bring him in so that he could kind of elaborate a little bit more. I'm sure I didn't do any justice with reading that, and we could have Brian talk a little bit more about State Street and his business, Shea Consultant, as well as what he has going on personally with his family. So let's go ahead and welcome Brian to the show. Hey Brian, how's it going?
Hey Joel, how's it going? Thanks
All
for
right.
having me.
All right, thank you for being here today, and giving us the time, the Startup Dad community, the time to chat with you. And I kind of titled this interview, building a consulting company business with a newborn, because I know when you decided to make the leap, it was right around the time that you had your daughter. So I kind of titled that, and I think that was a good title. And you could let me know if you want to tweak that a little bit. But before we go into that, why don't you give us a little bit more about who you are, your background, and family situation, if however much you want to share.
Sure, yeah. So, thanks for the kind intro and having me on. The business that I started is called Shea Consulting LLC. Like I think you gave a good background on it. Basically, what we do is help companies build systems that help them do marketing and sales better. There's a lot of sort of inside baseball in that bio that you read that sort of the general audience might not be interested in. But basically, we build software that helps companies sell more of their products or services. And yeah, as far as family goes, I started the company 2 or 3 months after my daughter was born, and so it definitely was starting a consulting business with a newborn. That was definitely the experience, and it's been a good one. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Awesome, awesome. Hey, Joe, to kick off the show, we really like to try to get the kind of the inspiration, because what we're really trying to do with Startup Dad is inspire dads to begin their journey, right?
Hmm.
They currently have a job, and just like yourself, you got inspired by some means to decide to take the leap and start your own business. So we typically like to start the show with something that inspires you, either daily, weekly, something that gets you motivated to keep pushing forward with your business. Whether that's a quote, whether that's some music. I know music for me definitely inspires me and gets me going. Um, is there something you'd like to share with the Startup Dad community that typically inspires you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing that inspires me, it may sound kind of corny, but it's just the people that I work with, like partners and clients that I work with, like literally the people that I work with day to day. That's what inspires me. Even when I had a full-time job, that was the thing that I love most about having a full-time job is going in every day and working with, the people that were on my team. Now that I work on my own, it's the same thing, but it's the same thing and it's different at the same time. Like when the people you're working with are your own clients, it just brings even more meaning and importance to it. But that's definitely the thing that keeps me going, even when it's hard, is the people that I'm working with, the people that I'm trying to serve. That's why I do this.
Nice, nice. So just to So you're very much inspired by the connections. So your business is more um, face to face, offline as opposed to online, right?
Yeah, so I do a blog. I have a website, and I'm active on social media. But it's definitely so. I should talk a little bit more. Like, I've been doing this business full time for about 2 years now, and for the most part, my clients have been companies like large size, medium size companies. And for those buyers, what I found is that face to face is kind of still where it's at.
Mm-hmm.
There are definitely friends and other people I know where they do a lot more online because that's kind of where their market is. But for the clients that I've been working with, it's more of kind of a face to face meetings and that kind of thing. So I sort of do the online thing, but there's also a major offline component as well.
Okay, great. Awesome. So sort of that is really kind of, there's a lot of entrepreneur podcasts out there currently, awesome podcasts that are talking about the current state, right? Where you are now. And Startup Dad, we like to kind of talk about where you were. So take us back to the 2 years ago, when you just decided to launch your business, maybe even before that, how you came up with the idea of launching your business and a newborn on the way. So take us back to that time, like what was the discussion you had with your wife? What was the overall picture?
Sure. So it was 2012 when I started the business, and really um, I had wanted to start my own business for like years and years before that. Like I
Mm-hmm.
had just been interested in just starting my own business, and I had done some kind of freelancing on the side. Like my background was in technology and technology management, so I did some consulting for like small companies and small businesses, doing stuff like websites and web strategy and stuff like that.
Right.
And I was just always interested in doing it, working for myself, but I just had never made the leap. And literally, when my daughter was born, like it was like the next day, I was like, man, I have got to leave my job and start a business because it's like I wanted to do it for so long, and I was inspired by my daughter being born. Before she was born, I was kind of like, okay, I'm going to put this on hold until she's born, and then as soon as she was, it was like I want to inspire my daughter in a way that I don't feel like I can if I'm just sort of working at this job that I don't 100% want to be at. So I
Right.
sort of made the decision, midway through 2012, and then a couple months after that, like a friend and colleague of mine who's a freelance consultant was approached about a job that he couldn't take. He couldn't do the job, and he knew that I was sort of interested in making the leap. And he was like, "Hey, if you want this gig, I'll set you up with the potential client, and you can talk to them." I talked with them, and basically they were looking for work for about it was either 3 or 6 months,
Mm-hmm.
a 3 or 6 month contract, and I was kind of like, well, it's definitely a risk to leave my job to do a gig, you know, a small consulting gig for 3 or 6 months, but it felt long enough where it was like this is probably the most secure thing I could do not doing a job. So I was like,
Right.
if I'm gonna go, this is probably the time to go because it's relatively rare to get that long of a contract like in the consulting space that I'm in. So I made the decision to do it, and it was like that's sort of a theme for me is like you need to make in business you need to make decisions, and you need to make sort of educated guesses and small leaps of faith, but I try not to do like mega leaps of faith, like putting everything on the line. I try to strike a balance between being safe, but also if you're too safe you never make any decisions. So that
Yeah.
was sort of the first thing for me is sort of taking a calculated risk there and leaving my job for that first gig.
Yeah. Okay. So you said that a couple of things I want to kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. You said that you decided after a number of years of thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, uh, you 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 finally made the decision to take that leap. Was there anything else that inspired you to make that decision at that time? I know the opportunity came around, but I'm sure you had other opportunities the years prior that you could have made the decision? Was it just because of your daughter being born, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't think there was anything. Definitely, my daughter being born was a big part of it. But like
Hmm.
you said, I mean, I could have done it the year before. I could have done it 2 years before. I think one of the big things, aside from my daughter being born, was, I in the year or two prior, I had been connecting with more and more people who were entrepreneurs and who had
Okay.
started their own businesses. Before that, I really didn't know anybody like me who had started their own business. Like I knew people, but it would be like, oh, some guy who's like 30 years older than me 25 years ago started a
Right.
business. Like, oh, that's not really useful. But,
Right.
the 2 years prior, I started connecting with more and more people who were doing it. So I got more confidence that it was possible.
Yeah.
Whereas before that, I kept working at these, you work at like big companies or big organizations and nobody knows how to start a business. It's not familiar. It just feels sort of unrealistic. But once you start meeting people that have actually done it, it's like, oh, this is totally doable. It may be hard, it may be, a certain
Right.
amount of risk, but it's like people have done it. And for me, that's a huge lesson. It's like I I think it's almost impossible to start a business if you don't know personally other people that have started a business. Because
Yeah.
it just feels so unrealistic, at least for me.
Right.
Because you have all these people who are like, no, it's a bad idea, no, it's a bad idea, no, it's a bad idea, it's
Hmm.
risky. And then you have no counter argument to it. You're like, oh, I read this blog post. But you're like, yeah, I'm talking to this person. Like, I don't know anybody. It's like you're reading stuff online by people you don't know, and they're saying it's possible, but it doesn't feel possible. So for me, that was a huge thing, like a year or two of like just having those conversations with people who are out there doing it just gives you so much um, I don't even want to say confidence, just the feeling that it's like a realistic thing to do.
Yeah. 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 That's a great point, and that it's who you surround yourself with, right? Kind of if you're surrounded by individuals that basically living the grind, which is not, if that's what you want to do, that's completely fine.
Yep.
But in terms of thinking outside, I don't know if it's outside the box, or kind of expanding your knowledge of what is possible. It's kind of hard to have those conversations with those individuals. So surrounding yourself with other entrepreneurs that know where you're coming from and where you want to go, I think is big. Yeah, and yeah, I think you
Yeah.
explained
Yeah,
that.
I've heard people say like you're like the average of the five people you hang out the most with or
Right.
something. And when I first heard that, I was like, yeah, whatever. Sounds
Right.
good. But then you realize, I mean, if you're working at like a big company or something, and the people that you spend the most time with, because let's face it, the people you spend the most time with, a lot of times are the people that you work with. Like you'd like to think it's like your spouse or your kids or something, but you
Right.
know, your boss may be in the mix too, like it or not. So
Right.
if the people that you're spending the most time with are all people that are doing stuff that you don't want to be doing, it's bound to make you unhappy because that's going to be sort of your frame of reference. Like if you
Right.
want to work at a nonprofit, but you work at a corporation and everybody works at a corporation, it's probably going to make you unhappy because you don't know people that work at nonprofits. It's not something that you're getting exposed to in your daily life. So that was for me. That was the biggest thing. I just spoke with somebody like last week that's a corporate employee and interested in um, starting her own consulting business, and I told her like the biggest thing you can do is just meet people that um, have already started their own business or who want to start their own business, but really people that have started their own business. And the other thing I told her is like, if you reach out to people, a lot of times small business people love to talk about small business. There's
Yeah.
definitely people out there who are like super busy, and everybody's busy, so you have to be like, respectful of people's time. But there's a lot of small business people out there, myself included, that love to talk about small business. So
Right. Right.
a lot of times you can reach out to people and just be like, hey, can we do coffee or something?
Yeah. Yeah, and I also like the fact that you brought up making that decision. I had a recent interview with Kerry Uberburner, who also talked about making the decision, and he didn't use the word calculated risk, but the kind of like the example that he gave was that you have a kind of like a ship out in sea, and you're on port, and the ship is the business that you want to start. and
Hmm.
you have this distance between you and the ship, and you don't just leave your job
Right.
or try to jump into the ocean and try to swim towards that ship, right? You basically start taking those small steps, those calculated steps to bring that ship closer and closer and closer. Eventually, you're going to have to make a leap, but
Yep.
when you make that leap, have the ship closer to you than all the way out.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing, for me at least, it's a real balancing act in terms of, like I said, there's sort of this balance between you're always going to have to make some kind of a leap, like your guest said.
Hmm.
Um, there's always going to be something. You want to make it as small as possible, but there's always going to be some leap. And on the flip side, like what can you do? But what can you do to decrease it? Like, can you start your business on the side, or
Hmm.
can you that's a big one. Like full-time employees, like the idea of doing a side hustle is something that I think Pam Slim, our mutual friend, was the one that sort of came up with that term, or I
Hmm.
know she uses it a lot in terms of like, okay, you're a full-time employee, um, start your business on the side. With that said, there are some businesses that are really hard to start on the side.
Right.
Like I do consulting for companies, and companies usually work from 9 to 5, so it's hard to do something on the side when you've got a 9 to 5 job in that space.
Hmm.
Whereas I know other people who are like designers or software developers, like some of them have had a much easier time doing that, or bloggers, same thing, because you can do it off hours. But it
Hmm.
just depends. Here's what I'm trying to say. I feel like there's a lot of advice out there, on a whole bunch of things, but especially on like side hustles or how to start something without leaving, the island or the ship behind entirely.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it really depends on your individual business and what you're
Right.
trying to do. Because I think at times I would get hung up on like, okay, well, so and so whose blog I read or whose book I read said you should do it like this, and I
Right.
kept trying to do it like that, but it didn't. Like 37 Signals is a company that I really admire, and they talk about, they were a web design company. They had a whole bunch of web design clients, and they created this product and Basecamp that became popular, and they treated it like it was a client. So they basically, if they had 5 clients, once they got rid of one of them, they used Basecamp as like a client because it had income coming in, and
Hmm.
it's a really cool model. It's an awesome model.
Hmm.
It just didn't fit for my business. So I'd always be
Right.
like trying to think of like my job as like a client, but you only got one client. Like how, and then you want to work less
Right.
time, but you can't because that's not the nature of the job. And just was like what the fuck? Like it just like when you try to like fit like a square peg in a round hole, it just gets really frustrating. So sometimes, you know, for me, it was just important to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, like how can I take this advice and sort of use the kernel of truth in it, and kind of adapt it to my own business. So
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because, one of the things that we're trying to do at Startup Dad is that I think there is a lot of resources out there that talk about how to start something on the side. And like you said, often it's online business. Like, how do you start your online business,
hmm
or, freelancing, something you could do in the middle of the night. You don't need other businesses to be open to kind of communicate with them. And one of the things we're trying to do at Startup Dad is bring in entrepreneur dads who have started, and I guess I should say entrepreneur and small business owners, because I don't know, sometimes that entrepreneur,
yeah,
doesn't really match up with a small business owner.
yep,
But I want to also bring in those small business owners that own a physical building,
yep,
as their main place of work, and how did they do that, as well as the online e-commerce and consulting, just like yourself, who is still kind of online, offline as well. So kind of bringing in the full breadth of knowledge and experience from the different startup dads that are out there.
yeah. I think that's great because they are so different, right? Like being an entrepreneur. Like I know Seth Godin has made a distinction in his writing and his speaking between entrepreneurs and freelancers, and I've heard
Mm,
that sort of framework that he's used. I've heard it like spreading around a lot now, which I think is great. And he calls entrepreneurs people that start businesses that are bigger than themselves. So they start a business that they can sell. They start a business where if they go on vacation for a month, it's still open. Like
mm,
Starbucks is a business. What's that guy Schultz? Schultz, whether he's there or not, Starbucks still exists, as opposed
Right.
to Shea Consulting LLC, which is it's a company, but it's a freelance business essentially. We call it like consulting, but it's just one form of freelancing, which means I sell my time.
Right.
I there are different ways that I price projects, whether it's by the hour or by the project or different ways. But essentially, if I don't show up, nobody's paying you money, right?
Right.
And that's sort of the distinction between entrepreneurship and freelancing. And even if you break it down further, I mean, you mentioned online business versus offline business. We talked about consulting, freelancing, which is a different kind of consulting. There are people who are coaches. There are people that do e-commerce stuff. I have a friend that runs a small skincare company, but it's just him, and he has help from other people. But it's essentially a one-person company, but it's a brand that is has nothing to do with him. So that sort of almost blends between the freelance thing and the entrepreneurship thing. And then you've got people who are doing true startups, which are entrepreneurial ventures. And with all these things, they're all different. Like there's stuff that's consistent between them. But again, like me sort of trying to take 37 Signals recipe and apply it to my consulting business, there's stuff that just is different. And if you go in saying like, I'm going to, I'm going to read like the Zuckerman book on how to start a business.
Right.
The Facebook, what's the guy's name? Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the Mark Zuckerberg playbook and use it for like my, brick and mortar gym.
Right.
Like you might get a lot of good lessons there, but you're probably going to run into like some pain points because they're just different. Different businesses are just different. Yeah. Another story that I was talking with somebody else that I know that's a consultant and sells to relatively large businesses, and we were talking yesterday about how both of us tried to do a lot of like online stuff, like doing a blog and stuff. And we were both talking about how, after we did it for about 6 months, we realized that like, the customers that we sell to, like they're not the kind of people that read blogs, let alone like my blog. You know what I mean? They're companies that read like established like literature in their community. So they're reading like industry rags that were set up like 40 years ago. They're not reading like the Shea Consulting LLC blog.
Right.
Whereas other businesses, like again, 37 Signals, they're a small business software company, and their blog is probably their greatest marketing tool that they have. They're just different markets.
Yeah.
So again, it's like I could look at 37 Signals and be like, God damn it, how come their blog blew up and mine didn't? It's because they're selling to like hipster design companies, and I'm selling to big established companies. Like they're just different cultures, different different markets. Yeah.
Knowing your avatar, knowing where they go online, where they go when they're in Barnes and Noble, what book aisles they venture towards. Awesome.
Yeah,
we could talk about that stuff for days. But let's take it back a little bit, because like I said, with Startup Dad, it's really kind of looking at the beginning stages of your business, and you kind of talked about some of the steps that you took to make your vision a reality. So you had that opportunity that presented itself. Can you share with us a failure or doubt or fear? So now you've made that leap. You've left State Street, and you started Shea Consulting LLC. Have you had any failures or doubts or fears in that 2 year, during your 2 year journey with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
You know that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think again, it's kind of like a cliche thing, but it's like if you're not failing, like you're probably not doing much. So, but yeah, in terms of like fears and stuff, like the first project that I told you I got an initial 3-month project when I left, 3 or 6 month project when I left State Street, and that was sort of what started it up for me. And after about 2 months of doing that project, I realized like this project was not a good fit at all. And I was like, man, this is like not a good project, like one of the worst projects that I had ever worked on for a whole bunch of reasons. And you're sort of at that point, like I never was like, oh man, I shouldn't have done this, but you sort of have that fear of like, well, what if this, this initial contract falls through and and I didn't have anything else in the pipeline at the time. So it was like, man, huge, just really, really, a lot of fear going on at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It, and it was one of those things where once you're sort of in that position, it wasn't like it was the point of no return, but you're sort of in it and you've got a project and you can either try to make it work or just, cut your loss and try to find something, try to develop more business, or what I did is I did both. But either way, like you've got to kind of, you just have to kind of figure it out. And I think that's something that's really important and really great to experience in a way, because you're in it, you figure it out, and you realize that like you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas beforehand, before when I was at my full-time job, you're thinking through your head, man, like what if I get this project and it doesn't really work out, and I'm stuck. And to some extent that scenario happened, but I was able to sort of figure it out. And that gives you like huge confidence, because you know that not everything is going to go perfectly, but I can figure it out. So the fear still exists, because you never know what's coming down, what's going to be coming down the street. But for me, it's been sort of the one thing that I've been very conscious about is the idea of like practice. Like for me, like people use the term like consulting practice, and for me, like that's an important term, because for me it's very much about getting better at this.
Mm-hmm.
Not only in terms of the work that I do with clients, but the business side, and being comfortable with the business side, and getting better at being more comfortable with the uncertainty involved with kind of owning your own business and doing your own thing.
Okay. Awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
completely makes sense. And so the moment so you just shared with us the fears and doubts that a lot of startup dads go through, and that's kind of amplified, right? I think um you know inherently, like with being a dad, and being
Mm.
a husband, those fears are now multiplied because you have two other individuals in your case that you have to take care of, right? And you have to worry about, right? So it's not if I fail, oh yeah, I just kind of you know rent a little shack and kind of eat peanut butter and jelly, and go, and I'll find a job, or find the next venture. you know you
Yeah.
you have those doubt and fears that you're dealing with on a daily basis or a weekly basis, and you at the back of your mind, you always have that family that you have to take care of. So
Yeah, it's funny that you say that too, because I said when I started the business, like my first project was tough, and I sort of had to get more comfortable dealing with uncertainty and kind of making things up as I went along. And it
mhm,
was at the exact same time, my daughter was 2 or 3 months old, and as you know, like with your first child, like you're learning all this new stuff and figuring out as you go along. So it was very much the same experience in that sense, where I don't know, I feel like both with starting a business for the first time and with um, having your first child, there's this experience of not being prepared. Like people say, like with your first child, like you can never be fully prepared. And for me, those were the two experiences in my life where it was sort of like that, where you sort of go in and you're just sort of trying to figure it out, and you become more comfortable with that.
mhm,
So it's interesting you brought up the parenthood thing and
mhm,
the spouse thing. But I mean, what you were talking about was in regard to like, okay, I'm a parent, I'm a spouse, I've got responsibility to earn a living for my family, so we have the income that we need, and that's definitely it's a huge thing. It's a totally huge thing. I found for me though that when I first graduated college,
mhm,
people would say, oh well, there'd be a few people that say, oh, if you want to do something, if you want to travel, you want to start a business, you want to do X, Y, or Z, like do it now because it gets harder and harder.
mhm,
But you also have the people like, oh, like we're in a recession or whatever the case may be, or this isn't a good time to start a business. And for me, those were the voices that I listened to. So I was 22,
Right.
the economy wasn't great, and you hear people like, oh, just try to get a job. So I was like, yeah, they're right. Hunker down, like get a job. And then it was like the mid 2000s, and the economy was better, and I had a little bit more experience. But I was like, oh, this is now I need to, I can't start a business or I can't do what I want to do because now I need to build on what I've already done,
Mm-hmm.
And then my wife and I got married, and it's like, okay, well now I got to get serious because we're married. And
Right.
then, my wife was pregnant, and you get those same voices where it's like people were like, now you got to get serious about this. And I realized like it never ends. Like there's never going to be a point where people, oh, it's great. This is the perfect time to do what you want to do. This is the
Right.
perfect time to start. Like there's always a reason not to do it.
Not to do
And I
it.
remember when I left, the company that I was at, it's a big company. When I left right after my daughter was born, somebody said to me like, you're not supposed to do this now. You're not supposed to leave your job now. You're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do it. And I asked the guy like sort of rhetorically, like, well, when exactly should I do it? Like literally every single time in my career, whether it was leaving college or leaving my first job or leaving my second job or going to graduate school or leaving graduate, whatever it may be, every point along the way, I feel like as I was leaving, there was this one or two people that were always like the voice of like conventional wisdom who was like, oh, it's a bad, whatever you're doing, going from what you have now to something else is a bad idea. Like it's just
Yeah.
a terrible idea. Like I remember when I left, one of my first jobs to go to graduate school, somebody's like, well, man, like what if there's, a recession when you leave graduate school? I was like, yeah, I get. And I remember he talking to us and me like, man, they're right. What if there is a recession?
Right.
And then you realize like there's those people are always there. They're always going to be there.
Yeah.
It's like no matter what you do, and it's funny because the thing that was, when I left my job to go to graduate school, it was like it, it was the people looking at it like, oh man, you shouldn't be trying to do this new thing. And then 2 years later, the thing that was new 2 years ago is now the safe thing. So you have people saying like 2 years ago they're saying, oh, you shouldn't do that, and now 2 years later they're saying, well, you got to do that. That's all you know. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, what is it? So
Right.
it's just the point. Like there's always, I don't know, there's always a reason not to do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. There's never. So what I'm getting is never the right time. Right.
Yeah,
It's never the right time to do something. Is
yeah,
basically it. And it. And the other thing that you ended up doing, you talked about the economy not being, not being completely healthy, right? So
yep,
2012, 4 years after 2008, right? So economy was still struggling. At the
yep,
same time, having a newborn, right? And you took the leap during both of those huge, life impacting situations, right? You're taking a leap in an economy that's uncertain, as well as
yep,
having a child. So how did that,
yeah,
right now I'm just loving this interview, and I'm kind of like throwing out my questions because
yeah, yeah.
everything everything that you're bringing up is just bringing more questions and questions. Like, how did that conversation go with your wife? In
Oh
terms
my
of
God, well, first of all, like my wife is, um, I don't know, like what word to use, but my wife is so supportive.
Hmm.
Like it just, I don't know, like it's like having a spouse that you can talk to and share things with and is supportive of what you want to do. Um, it, I don't know how I would do it without my wife. Do you know what I mean? It's
Right.
like, so for, I guess for people out there who are like watching this and are like, I don't know, like they don't have a good relationship with their wife or their wife isn't supportive, like I don't know what to say to you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm lucky in that sense. Like my wife
Right.
is very supportive, but it was about sort of laying out what I wanted to do in a clear way and
Hmm.
communicating with her, okay, this is what I want to do and this is what I think I can earn doing it.
Hmm.
And this is why. And then making sure that she was comfortable with it um, and I think both of us are on the same page in terms of like what we want, what our goals are like in life and financially, and how we look at parenthood.
Hmm.
Like we look at parenthood and what we want to give to our daughter in terms of like experiences and values and for both of us, the idea of like independence and being sort of true to ourselves and true to our values is important. So like having a, a bigger and bigger house is important, sort of, but it's way further down the list than being able to say like, hey, I'm doing work that I'm proud of, as opposed to like, I'm doing work that I don't like, but we're gonna move to a bigger house. Like that for us, that was something for us that it's just a bigger priority for us to do that, to be able to sort of lead by example in the work that we do. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
that's a big thing in terms of spouse. I mean, the other thing, like jokingly, is like I think my wife was so tired of hearing me like talk about what I wanted to do. Like I think part of her was like, nice, I don't have to listen to him anymore.
Right.
That's probably the other thing.
She was like, man up and just do it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Like, I'll talk about stuff a lot. Like, I have, business ideas a lot. And it's funny. Like, she'll be the one who's like, okay, like, you need to stop talking about it. Like, it's a good idea. You either need to do or it's a good enough idea. Like, we don't know if it's gonna succeed or not, but it's good enough. And you either need to do it or you need to just like stop talking to me about it and be quiet. You know what I mean? Like, it's one or the other. And she's awesome like that. Like, she's like, yeah, like just.
Just do it.
Yeah, you need to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or not do it. But either way, like I think the other thing that we both agree on is like just talking about stuff all the time just is not the way to go. It's like it's just not. Because you can talk about, like I said, you can talk about stuff forever. You can talk about stuff forever, and there's never the perfect time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a theme that I'm getting from a couple of the interviews that I've done is that, you know, you kind of jokingly talked about the unsupportive spouse, and one of the things that I've seen with the entrepreneur dads that I've interviewed, the startup dads that I've interviewed, is that they lay it out, right?
Yep.
Whether it's you and I have a mutual friend who
Yeah.
who did a whole PowerPoint presentation
Yeah.
about it, and one of my other past guests basically talked about creating a framework, just
Mm-hmm.
kind of framework saying, hey, here's what I'm looking at, here's how I'm gonna exactly what you talked about, here's how it's gonna generate income, what do you think? And I think if you approach it that way, with as opposed to like haphazardly just coming to your spouse and saying, hey, I want to start my own business and I'm gonna quit
Mm-hmm.
my job tomorrow, if you approach it with some kind of thought process, and kind of could show that, hey, you got this kind of somewhat figured out. I think most spouses, if they if they love you, if they still love you, they'll somewhat
Someone figured out.
right, somewhat figured out, they'll
um,
they'll support it.
yeah. What's funny too is I was talking. I said yesterday I was talking with like a fellow consultant, and she was talking. We were talking about kids, and I was saying one of the things, before my daughter was born, I was thinking, okay, so once she's gonna be born, and that's gonna be the big like uncertainty thing, and then after that, like it sort of becomes more like steady or something after that, or more like steady. And I realized like after a couple months of my daughter being here is like there's just constantly new stuff happening that you're seeing for the first time, right? And you've had the same experience, I'm sure. And it's the same thing with a business too. Is like, you think like, okay, I'm gonna start it, and then like leaving my job and starting, it's gonna be like the big threshold, and it is to some extent. But then it's like you get your first client, and then that's a big threshold, and then like, okay, well, you get 3 clients, and you realize like, well, these aren't really the right clients. There's this new thing that and it's the same thing. Like there's not like one big, like you watch like movies and stuff, and there's always this big event, this thing, like we landed the big account, and it's like never, I don't know, like maybe my life's just boring, but that like it's never been my experience. There's never been like the huge like, oh, we got this thing and now everything's awesome, and it's like it's just stuff, there's always stuff to figure out. So, and I know other folks too who like, I think I mentioned to you like a number of, I was at WDS this year, and a number of folks who have been doing consulting a lot longer than me mentioned like, hey, I left my job, and then I was doing consulting for a couple of years, and they mentioned like there was really like an inflection point or something like 2 or 3 years after they started where they decided like, what they had been doing for consulting wasn't exactly a right fit, and they needed to focus a little bit more, where they had been just kind of taking business from whoever would give it to them, and they realized like, okay, well, what I really want to do is X, so I'm going to get rid of everything else. I'm just going to do X.
Yeah.
Um, and it's all to say, like, I don't know, we have this picture of like, we leave our job, we start a business, and the business is either successful or it's not, but there's just all these, it's just constantly figuring stuff out, you
Yeah.
know. And I remember too, like, talking with a mutual friend when I started my, I think before I left and started my consulting practice, she was like, oh, you know, it's good to, she mentioned like practicing something. It's good to practice that because, you know, as you get further and further along, you want to do bigger and bigger projects, and
Mhm.
it gets you more comfortable doing that. And I remember sort of thinking to her like, no, like once I start my consulting, I'm like, that's the big thing.
Right.
Like once I get that, like that's gonna be the thing. Like what do I mean? Like do bigger and bigger,
What
like
do you mean by that? Right.
yeah, that's gonna be it. And I realized like totally, like you sort of look back and you're like, no, it's just constantly,
Yeah.
stuff evolves constantly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was one of the what you talked about earlier with the analogy that you brought up between the having your daughter and your business. That was one of the a lot of people ask me, why did you come up with that? Why are you using that image as your logo for Startup Dad? And and that's really my thought process with that.
they're like that guy in your logo is really ugly. Why are you
Right,
using that?
right, right.
Why you got that ugly guy on your logo?
Why
Yeah,
are you using that guy?
yeah.
Yeah,
There's
but
cute kids in the ugly guy.
right, but the reason why I use the logo is because to me it's a similar analogy where it's like as your child is your child's gonna grow, and it's gonna be every day. It's not gonna be like this huge thing that's gonna happen, but it's gonna be every day. There's gonna be something little that's gonna change, right? Like
Yeah,
I see my daughter, my 2-year-old now, well, soon to be 2 years old, and one day she'll go to sleep, we'll wake up the next day, and it looks like
yeah,
she aged a whole week or something like that.
yeah,
It's just like
yeah.
instantly. And I think it's similar with your business, and it's something that your daughter you nurture, your business you nurture, and it's something that you want to see grow and blossom, right? So that's kind of like my thought process behind my logo. The other thing you talked about, which I think is important, is kind of going into business, you know, with the mindset of, hey, I'm leaving this company because sometimes you're leaving because you're doing the same thing. It
Hmm.
becomes tedious, it's a day in and day out. And now you decide to start your own business, and then you're doing this, after a couple of years, you find yourself doing the same thing.
Yep,
Maybe it's not fun anymore.
yep.
And I think it's important for individuals and startup dads out there to think about it in a way where you know what you're starting today doesn't have to be the same thing you're doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, right? You diversify, you build on it, you pivot maybe and take
Mhm.
down a different path, because business is changing so rapidly now, with social media and things that are becoming available. If you stay stuck in the same way of doing business like 10 years ago, you're going to get left behind, right? So
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
I think
that's
it's
true. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's true of employees. I think it's true of business
Right.
people. Like I think we were brought up, and I think the sort of the default mindset, I know for me, like I still sort of fight against it, is this idea like you've got a career and you've got a job,
Mhm.
and the idea that you're a whatever, you're an engineer, you're a mechanical engineer, and that's like your career, and you're constantly maybe getting better at that or getting higher and higher roles as a mechanical engineer, but that there's sort of something about like a path about it.
Yeah.
And I think, especially as an employee, that's the way like our managers and companies talk about it, and it's the way we think about it is like, oh well, I've got this job, and then like I've got a 5-year plan. What do you want to do 5 years from now? And I'm getting more and more comfortable with sort of like, well, I don't know what I want to do 5 years from now. I don't know what's going to be out there 5 years from
Right.
now.
Right.
It's like, especially for me, like I work in kind of this weird intersection of like business and technology, where it's like where I help businesses now do marketing better using the technology that's available. Well, 5 years from now, the technology is going to be different.
Right.
There's a lot of things that stay the same, right? There's a lot of things about, we're still going to be selling to people, relationships are still going to matter, but the technology is going to be totally different. The way we built websites 10 years ago was completely different than what we do
Right.
now. I remember like 10 years ago, it was sort of stupid at the time. It was a stupid idea at the time, but it's a really stupid idea now. Is like I was like, oh, I'm going to build like a cool, essentially like build like a custom like WordPress type of thing. But
Hmm.
WordPress was already built at that. I mean, so it was a bad idea then. But now it's like even more absurd because there's so many tools out there to like publish your blog.
Right.
Like
Right.
it just isn't an issue anymore. Like I remember that guy Derek Sivers who started a online CD company was talking about like in I don't know the late 90s or early 2000s when he did it. One of his biggest problems was processing credit cards. Like it took him forever to
Right.
figure out how to like he had to like custom code something. He had to contact like the credit card company and like figure out how to do it. Now it's like an hour. Like you
Right.
just get a PayPal account, you get some like widget or something, you put it in your WordPress site and you're done. Or you
Right.
get some e-commerce thing and you're done and that's it.
Yeah, it's
Um,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah, and that stuff's going to continue to happen.
Right.
That stuff's going to continue to happen, and it's not about like locking something in. Like I've got this business and now I'm like locked in for the next 10 years. Like I've got income for the next 10 years. Like that's how I think in the past sometimes I've thought about a job like, okay, well I got this job and that's going to really set me on a path, lock me in for like 5 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like a couple of things, like number one, it's not realistic. Number two, it's not even my personality. Like the
Mm-hmm.
idea of being locked in doing the same thing 5 years from now that I'm doing now is like not very exciting.
Yeah. And I think number three is that that company might not have you there 5, 10 years from now, right?
Right, right. Especially if your idea is I don't want anything to change, right? They're
Right.
gonna be like, yeah, sorry, but we're good. You can leave now.
Right. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Like stuff changes, and I think there's yeah, I just think that's the way it is, and sometimes we forget that because we're again brought up to sort of think about jobs and careers
Yeah.
and we all know that you're not going to be with the same company for like 30 or 40 years, but I think there's still um, that feeling that we can somehow like plan out like 5 or 10 years in advance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So I know we're running short of time here, so let me jump back to some of my questions here.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome.
I know like we talked before, and I know you've got like questions
Right.
that I can keep going on. This is like the thing, like 5 or 10 years, like I keep, it's like a metaphor for the business thing. I keep like messing up our plan.
No, 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 no. It's a great conversation, and my questions, the way I kind of have my questions laid out, just for, and I don't think I've mentioned it to the Startup Dad community, but I have a set of questions. But if the conversation definitely lends to opening up new questions, different questions, I'm completely comfortable with doing that and kind of diving into some of those questions a little bit more, because I think sticking to the same a set framework might not be, depending on the guest, it might not be the best for the startup dad community. So, but yeah, I think some of the things we talked about was key. So one of the questions I have is, this at this time, want to try to reach into your toolbox, right? It's kind of like hey, you know, here's all the things that I use. Here's all the things that I find that make my life a little bit easier. So some of the tips and tricks that you use to kind of make your business and your family life kind of balance out, or balancing it out. So I got a couple of questions real quick. So how do you balance between your family and your business?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I used to be, and I still struggle with it, of like having, I say I'm going to stop working at like 5:30 or 6, and then it kind of spills over.
Mm,
But just sort of being really putting kind of boundaries around business stuff.
mm,
So it's like whatever my schedule is for that particular day. Like if I'm planning to be finished by 5:30, like honoring that. Because it's very easy to be like, oh, I'll just send one more email, or I just do one more thing, or I'll just do one more call, and then it ends up being 6:15. And it's one of those things, like in one particular day, it may not be the end of the world, like you go over half an hour or 45 minutes. But again, it's about respecting the time of your family and your partner and valuing that time. Um, because I don't know, like I feel like there's a lot of urgency in the business world. There's a
Mm.
lot of like, this needs to happen now, this needs to happen now. And if you just sort of default to whatever's screaming the loudest at the time, um, well, with kids, that's sort of maybe a bad metaphor, but if you default to what sort of, you know, the thing that you need to get done right now, I feel like I always default to business stuff because
Mm.
you've got a client that's emailing about something. So that's one thing, is just being respectful of the boundaries. Like, I know people talk about like, oh, blending work life and personal life, and I know what they're talking about. Like, it's not about balance, it's about blending. Um,
Mm.
but for me, there's also, if you're checking your BlackBerry or your iPhone at dinner, um, you're
Mm.
not really blending anything. You're just doing work at dinner. So it's like you need to set some boundaries. That's one thing. And the other thing for me that I've started recently is I used to get big into, like, I'd make all these like to-do lists and stuff. I'd have all this stuff going on, and it would get a little bit overwhelming. So what I started to do, I'd done it a little bit in the past, and I started doing it again. It's really worked well for me. Is um, the morning, I wake up in the morning or the night before, I think about what's the number one business thing that I need to get done the next day.
Mm.
And I make sure I take that more seriously than anything else. I do it usually first thing in the morning and get it
Yeah.
done. Because what I'd find is I'd have 11 things on the list, one that was really important, and then 10 other things. And the end of the day would come around, and I'd get done like 9 things, none of which are the most important. Because usually the one that's most important, you're most like nervous about, or is like a hard conversation, or you got to call a client, or this, whatever it may be. It's always easy to be like, oh, I got 11 things, I'll just do this other one. I'll just do this other one. And at the end of the day, you don't get the thing done that's important. So that's another kind of trick that I do.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a book, and I'll add it in the show notes. I can't remember the name of the author right now, but it's called like one thing, right? Like it's, I don't know if you've read it, but it's basically
Hmm.
focused on basically just exactly what you're talking about. Is like, hey, you have this list of things that you need to do. They're all somewhat important and need to get prioritized at some point, but just focus on doing, kind of, and it also kind of talks about like multitasking, right? And how that is not, it's kind of like a myth, right? I think
Yep.
you kind of talked about it, is maybe blending is like another way of saying multitasking, where you're at the dinner table trying to do, sneaking
Yeah.
to kind of answer an email while
Yeah.
pretending to spend time with your family.
Right.
And this book just basically talks about like, just focus on one thing. If you could just do
Yep.
one thing that day, what is the one thing that you'll do to move your business, your project, forward? So yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
um can you share, actually, you just talked about a personal habit that you do. What about in terms of the boundaries? Do you also have boundaries for your work? Because I know as a consultant, sometimes you do work from home.
Yep.
So do you set boundaries for, hey, this is my work time, and then you have the screaming child, or you have your wife that pops into the office to say, hey, like, how do you manage that aspect of things?
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah. So when I do, it's the same way. Like, when I work when I'm at home during the week, usually I'm the only one here at that time, so there's not really an issue with
Mhm.
that. But
Mhm.
sometimes on the weekend, um, if I've got work to do or my wife has work to do, we like establish it,
Mhm.
at the beginning of the day or the beginning of the weekend. Like, okay, on Sunday from, you know 10 to 1, I've got to do this piece of work, and that's what I got to do. Because in
Mhm.
the past, we would, even before I started my own business, I would have this idea like, okay, well, I'm going to spend 2 hours on Saturday doing whatever, a blog post or whatever it may be, some piece of
Mhm.
work.
Right.
And I'd sort of communicate to that to my wife, but not really clearly. So she'd be like, oh, why don't we go to lunch or something, and I'd be working on a blog post. I mean, well, what the hell? I'm like doing this blog post. Like, why? But really, I hadn't really communicated it. I was like, at some point in the day, I'm going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my own head, I realized, like, now I'm going to do it, but I hadn't communicated that. So we try to be really clear about that. Like, okay, I need this time.
Yeah.
And because you can't, like, you just can't do work. You can't do work and be like watching your kid at the same time. It's the same thing like with, you can try to multitask, but it's the same thing like checking your iPhone at dinner. It's not that you're doing both, it's that you're checking your iPhone and ruining dinner. You know what I mean? It's the same thing. Like, you're not going to be able to watch your kid, when your kid is awake and playing,
Mm-hmm.
and do business at the same. You're probably gonna end up doing both poorly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, do you have a resource that you use to kind of balance that? You talk about, like, you have your wife, she's works, and then you have the your daughter. Do you have any kind of resource that you guys use to kind of communicate better, or kind of stay on task?
I mean, we just use, in terms of calendar, we just use like our iPhone calendars and we sync them up. It sounds simple, but most of the tools that I use are pretty simple. Like my background in tech working with technology, I found that generally the simpler the software, the better. Like, once you understand the problem that you're trying to solve, the
Mm-hmm.
technology usually gets much, much, much simpler. Like, I find when you've got too much, like, oh, we've done this and this with technology, and we've got this thing that's linked to this, and then it's linked to that, and blah blah blah, all this different stuff. Like, for me, a lot of times that's like a red flag that you're just automating stuff that you're not really clear about. So in terms of what we use, we just use like our iPhone calendars, and we just made sure they were linked. So basically, whenever I've got something going on, or whenever she gets it, we just put it on the calendar. We both see it, and it's really, really helped us. We had tried different setup, like really like lots of different setups with calendars and stuff, but we just found that one worked well. And the same thing for me. Like, I have a to-do app that I use called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's to-do, but it's spelled TEUXDEUX. And it's made by a woman, Tina Roth Eisenberg, who started a bunch of other cool stuff like Creative Mornings and Tatley, and now I'm blanking on all the cool stuff that she's done.
Mm-hmm.
But she's like in terms of business, like one of the people that is just the most amazing persons out there. Like, she just does amazing stuff, and she's extremely generous. But anyways, this to-do app is just very, very simple, very clean application, and I use that to manage my to-dos, and then I use a CRM system to manage my contacts, and those really are, for me, like the core business apps. It's like a calendar, a CRM. I've got like Google apps that I use for stuff and email, but it's a CRM, a to-do app, and a calendar.
Nice.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay, two more questions to wrap up. So, is there a book or blog, magazine, something that you would recommend every startup dad to read?
I mean, it depends. It depends on, like, again, like what your business is
Mm-hmm.
specifically, but everybody probably already knows it. But Seth Godin's blog is like a must read. I also think like John Jance's Duct Tape Marketing is great to read as well for people who are like small business owners.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're like trying to do like a digital startup or something, he might not be as useful. But I think his Duct Tape Marketing website is just awesome.
Okay, awesome. So, this one's a little bit longer of a question. So here we go. On the other side of this broadcast, listening in, is a startup dad who, at this point, is fired up and ready to go. But as soon as the broadcast is over, he will put down his mobile device or close his computer, and life is going to happen. And by next week, he will find himself right back in the day-to-day minutia of things. What would you say to that dad to inspire him beyond this broadcast and in the weeks to come?
I think what you said there, the idea of you close your you're totally into starting your business, you close your laptop, you go to your job, and everybody at your job is like, okay, the TPS reports are due. Okay, we got another whatever big company thing going on, and nobody's talking about starting a business. So I definitely go back to piece that I said about at the beginning about connecting with people who are not only interested in starting their own business, but that already have started their own businesses. Like
Mm,
get into whether there's a meetup in your area of entrepreneurs, or a small business meetup, or a conference like WDS, or reach out to somebody that you know that's already started a business. Like I just can't stress that enough, because if you're not talking to people that have already done it, it feels so unrealistic, or at least it did for me.
yeah.
You get back to that job and everybody's just talking about the big company, and you feel like it's just not realistic to believe this. But once you start, you'd be amazed. Once you start connecting with people that do this, and it's their way of life is to own their own business, like it just becomes so much more realistic. So um, I'd say connect with people that are already starting, that have already started their own business.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. So Brian, to wrap up the show, want to give you the opportunity to kind of talk about what you got going on in your business, and and how individuals can find you. In this case, I guess companies can find you for consulting help. So why don't you share a little bit about that, and then we'll say goodbye.
Sure. Cool. Yeah. So like I mentioned before, my business has really evolved to a place where I'm helping companies do their sales and marketing better using technology. So, working on things like customer relationship management software and similar things where it helps them to be much more organized, much more effective with how they reach prospective clients online and off, and really help them to sell more and get better clients. I've done that for years with established, large established companies, and more I'm starting to work with smaller business and independent consultants to help them um, just make more sales and have less overwhelm on a day-to-day basis. And it's going really well, and people can find me online at my consulting site, which is sheaconsulting.biz. And probably the best place to find me is to go to my blog, which is there's a couple links that you can go to, but brian-shea.com or thepurposeofbusiness.com. Either one of those will get you to my blog, and that's a great way to keep in touch and see what I'm doing.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, and I know I said we would say goodbye after that, but I think for the startup dads that are out there, I think it's important. Sometimes there's certain aspects of your business that you absolutely enjoy working on, and then there's certain
Mm-hmm.
aspects that you don't want to work on, right? And I know the CRM, the kind of that relationship management aspect. It's very important. It's probably
Yep.
one of the most important things in your business, but
Yep.
it's not something that everyone is very comfortable at doing and kind of
Mm-hmm.
wants to do. So I think Brian is the perfect person for that that kind of support. So thanks,
Yeah,
Brian.
yeah. If I can just say one more thing, yeah. I mean, it's absolutely true, and it's one of the things that um, I hear more and more people at big companies and at small companies say, like, "Oh man, we have trouble like reaching out to our clients. We have trouble reaching out to potential clients. We feel overwhelmed by this." And it's one of those things that you see when companies do it well. Like it becomes this great asset where they're
Mm,
able to connect with the right people in the right way. It helps their business, and it makes their lives so much less cluttered and less overwhelmed when they have a system in place to get new business. So yeah,
yeah, awesome. All right, Brian. So
cool
thank you
man.
again for your time, and we'll keep in contact, and we'll update the startup dad community with what you got going on, and sharing any of your posts going
Definitely.
forward. All right, Brian.
Cool man. See ya. Thanks. Thanks
Take
for
care.
having me.